It's something we were told throughout our entire lives. 6 million Jews and large numbers of non-Jews were murdered by the Nazis.
11 million people died in Nazi Germany's death camps. 6 million were Jews.
An estimated 6 million Jews were killed during World War II.
Hitler murdered 6 million Jewish people.
6 million Jews.
6 million died.
6 million people cried from the grave.
The term Holocaust commonly refers to the systematically planned and executed extermination of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany during World War II. Mainstream historians agree that, of these 6 million Jews, approximately 3 million were killed in gas chambers. The vast majority of them, they say, were killed or died in 6 extermination centers in Polish territory. Here's a breakdown of these 3 million alleged gas chamber victims by each of the 6 camps. These numbers are an average of figures found on the websites of 2 of the most reputable Holocaust research institutions, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Yad Vashem Museum in Jerusalem. The Holocaust is so important that the United Nations even decided to create a dedicated Memorial Day for it. Every January 27th, the day when the infamous Auschwitz camp was occupied by the Soviet Red Army in 1945, the whole world is reminded to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust. In 2017, on the occasion of this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the White House, under U.S. President Donald Trump, released this statement. Stop the video to read it if you like. There's nothing unusual about the statement, except maybe the fact that Jews aren't mentioned in it. That triggered quite some vitriolic reactions, for instance from Jonathan Greenblatt, the current head of the Jewish Anti-Defamation League. He tweeted on that same day that Trump did not even mention Jews, which triggered a deluge of similar attacks on the U.S. president for not having expressly mentioned the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust. The White House countered a day later that it wasn't just Jews who died in the Holocaust, but that 5 million Gentiles were killed too, who also deserve equal remembrance, referring to an article which had appeared 2 years earlier in the Huffington Post. That in turn unleashed a series of attacks on the president and that 2015 article, claiming that this, quote, 5 million Gentiles, unquote, victim figure is bogus and vastly overinflated. Among those, I may quote here the Times of Israel's take on this death toll. It's a statement that shows up regularly in declarations about the Nazi era. It is, however, a number without any scholarly basis. The 5 million non-Jewish Holocaust victims has driven Holocaust historians to distraction ever since Wiesenthal started to peddle it in the 1970s. Yehuda Bauer, an Israeli Holocaust scholar, said he warned his friend Wiesenthal about spreading the false notion that the Holocaust claimed 11 million victims, 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews. I said to him, "Simon, you are telling a lie," Bauer recalled in an interview Tuesday. He said, "Sometimes you need to do that to get the results for things you think are essential." Wiesenthal told them that he chose the 5 million number carefully. He wanted a number large enough to attract the attention of non-Jews who might not otherwise care about Jewish suffering, but not larger than the actual number of Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust, 6 million. It caught on. Deborah Lipstadt, a professor of Holocaust studies at Emory University in Atlanta, wrote in 2011, quote, "This number is simply inaccurate, in fact, made up," unquote. Deborah Lipstadt went over the top, however, by accusing Trump of flirting with Holocaust denial. So, here we seem to have a case where a prominent Jew, the late Simon Wiesenthal, inflated the number of Holocaust victims for political purposes. But did Wiesenthal really invent that number? And was he the only one exaggerating numbers? During and right after the end of the Second World War, a number of war propaganda movies were filmed with the support or even under the control of the U.S. government. Throughout these propaganda movies, there are many references to the thousands and even millions of victims of National Socialist barbarism. Yet none of these films ever single out Jews as the primary victims of a, quote, Holocaust. The most infamous among those propaganda movies was titled Die Todesmühlen, which was designed for, and eventually shown to, German audiences as a tool for shock and awe re-education. It was later also released in an English edition, Death Mills. Both movies mention as the death toll of National Socialist persecution 20 million, without making any specific reference to Jews.
But these 1,100 were a small fraction of the 20 million men, women, and children murdered by the Nazis. 20 million human beings, equal to the population of 22 American states. 20 million corpses.
In fact, the narrator insists that the victims were
of all the nations of Europe, of all religious faiths, of all political beliefs, condemned by Hitler because they were anti-Nazi.
This is only the most prominent example. There are more, which highlight that death toll claims of National Socialist persecution have a history of exceeding the 6 million, and the Jews have been mentioned with regularity as only one among many victim groups. This issue is also not just a matter of journalists and propagandists making up wild figures. In 2015, in a book about the forensic examination of mass murder locations of the Holocaust, a British archaeologist who has been working with the leading scientists in the field for several years wrote, quote, "The exact number of people killed during the Holocaust remains unknown. Some scholars have suggested a figure of around 11 million. Of these, it is estimated that approximately 6 million Jews were killed, but the number of Roma, Sinti, disabled people, political prisoners, and others killed cannot be estimated with complete certainty." She provides no source for that claim, though, so maybe she merely repeated what she had heard through Wiesenthal's grapevine. But is it really Wiesenthal's? Interestingly, the very same Washington Holocaust Museum that, according to the just-quoted article in the Times of Israel, issued a statement on Trump's text emphasizing the centrality of the annihilation of the Jews to the understanding of the Holocaust, had announced in 2013 in a press release that their research has revealed that, quote, "the Nazi Holocaust may have claimed up to 20 million lives," unquote, while leaving the 6 million Jewish death toll basically unchanged. This would mean that as many as 14 million non-Jews died in the Holocaust, not just 5. I may also point out that 20 million is not the ceiling of death toll estimates. For instance, an article of September 21, 1992, from Germany's most prestigious daily newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, illustrates in a very useful manner the kind of topic we are dealing with and the problems that are related to it. The title of the article translates to Traces of the Crime, Shoes, Even Children's Shoes. It is a report written by a student about his visit to the Stutthof concentration camp, not far from Danzig in post-war Poland, that has been turned into a museum. The author, in his 4th sentence, states that he cannot imagine what an extermination camp might look like and talks of, quote, installations in which 6 million Jews and a total of 26 million detainees were killed, unquote. So, here we have a combination of the general 20 million victims plus 6 million Jews. At the end of his account, the author writes that he found himself facing, quote, the remains of the most brutal genocide, the highly modern killing machines of the time, the cruelest crime of humanity, unquote. By putting things that way, one of the most highly regarded newspapers in the world has given its definition of the Holocaust. The annihilation of a total of 26 million people by the National Socialists in ultra-modern killing machines is the cruelest crime in the history of humanity. So, how many victims were there now? 6 million Jews plus a few others, or 11 in total, or 20, or even 26 million. At most, one of these figures can be correct, but with all this speculation going on, it may turn out that they are all wrong. But if that is so, what is the truth? Can you tell? One thing is for sure. We obviously cannot believe everything we hear about the Holocaust, because the things we hear often contradict one another. Let's start at the beginning with the documentary Nazi Concentration and Prison Camps that the Americans introduced during the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg in 1945 as proof of Nazi atrocities. Psychologically speaking, it was one of the most powerful pieces of evidence submitted, because a picture tells more than 1,000 words. Here are some scenes about the Dachau camp. Dachau was one of the first major camps the Americans captured toward the end of the war.
Hanging in orderly rows were the clothes of prisoners who had been suffocated in a lethal gas chamber. They had been persuaded to remove their clothing under the pretext of taking a shower, for which towels and soap were provided. This is the Brausbad, the shower bath. Inside the shower bath, the gas vents.
Actually, what you are seeing here are not gas vents, but recessed light fixtures.
On the ceiling, the dummy shower heads. In the engineer's room, the intake and outlet pipe. Push buttons to control inflow and outtake of gas. A hand valve to regulate pressure. Cyanide powder was used to generate the lethal smoke.
Interestingly, on August 19, 1961, a letter to the editors by German mainstream historian Martin Brosat was published in Germany's biggest weekly newspaper, Die Zeit, stating, among other things, Jews or other inmates were gassed neither in Dachau, nor in Bergen-Belsen, nor in Buchenwald. The gas chamber at Dachau was never fully completed and taken into operation. On January 24, 1993, the famous Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal wrote in a letter to the editors of the U.S. military magazine Stars and Stripes in the same vein. A gas chamber was in the process of being built at Dachau, but it was never completed. Thus, between the 1960s and late 1990s, the Dachau Museum had a sign displayed inside the Dachau gas chamber stating, "Gas chamber, disguised as a shower room, never used as a gas chamber." Today, however, this sign is no longer there. Instead, a less visible text on a sign outside that room states, "Gas chamber. This was the center of potential mass murder. The room was disguised as showers and equipped with fake shower spouts to mislead the victims and prevent them from refusing to enter the room." Currently, the U.S. Holocaust Museum itself admits, quote, "There is no credible evidence that the gas chamber in Barrack X was used to murder human beings." Barrack X was the official name for the crematorium building where that sinister room was located. One of the leading books by mainstream historians on the gas chamber question, the 1993 collective tome Nazi Mass Murder, states on page 202, "It has not yet been conclusively proved that killings by poison gas took place at the Dachau concentration camp." And on page 203 we read, "But during the trial there was only one witness, a Czech physician assigned to care for the prisoners, Dr. František Blaha, who declared that experimental gassings had taken place in the Dachau gas chamber. Blaha signed an affidavit on January 9, 1946, in which he described his experience with the Dachau gas chamber. It is in German, but an English translation was read into the record during the Nuremberg tribunal as follows. Many executions by gas or shooting or injections took place right in the camp. The gas chamber was completed in 1944. And I was called by Dr. Rascher to examine the first victims. Of the 8 or 9 persons in the chamber, there were 3 still alive, and the remainder appeared to be dead. Their eyes were red, and their faces were swollen. Many prisoners were later killed in this way. And that's it. If Blaha was the only witness on trial testifying about the gas chamber, and if he had no experience whatsoever about the gassing procedure, then how did the American documentary makers know that the victims
had been persuaded to remove their clothing under the pretext of taking a shower, for which towels and soap were provided?
Only a few days after the liberation of the Dachau camp, a number of U.S. congressmen visited the camp. Here they are, shown inside the gas chamber. And this is footage taken in 2016. As you can see, the ceiling of that room is rather low. In fact, the room is roughly 2.15 meters or 7 feet high. Why do I mention this? Because an official U.S. commission investigated what had transpired at Dachau, and in a report to the U.S. Congress dated May 15, 1945, compiled by David Chavez, we read, among other things, that in this room the ceiling was some 10 feet in height. How can anyone confuse 7 feet with 10 feet? But that's not all, because that report continues as follows. The supply of gas into the chamber was controlled by means of 2 valves on one of the outer walls, and beneath the valves was a small glass-covered peephole through which the operator could watch the victims die. The gas was let into the chamber through pipes terminating in perforated brass fixtures set into the ceiling. However, the ceiling did not have brass fixtures, but merely zinc-plated iron shower heads. Furthermore, as can be seen in this photo of a spot where a shower head had been removed by the Americans as a piece of evidence, these were merely fake shower heads, or rather watering can rosettes such as this, that were not connected to anything. Already, the documentary we watched earlier said that there was
a hand valve to regulate pressure.
But there's a problem. Zyklon B, which was allegedly used for the murder, was not a gas under pressure that could be fed into pipes. It consisted of gypsum pellets soaked with liquid hydrogen cyanide, the active ingredient in Zyklon B. When such a can was opened, its poison evaporated slowly. In addition, from many cases of accidental poisoning with hydrogen cyanide, and from executions with that poison as they were carried out in several U.S. states during the 20th century, we know that the victims Blaha claimed to have examined cannot have succumbed to Zyklon B. Such victims do not have red eyes. They do not have swollen faces. Actually, if they show any symptoms, it is a pinkish-reddish discoloration of their skin, as shown here. It is clear that the Americans, when making their documentaries and congressional reports, were jumping to a lot of conclusions, contradicting each other and the material facts in the process. But what's the truth here? The tubing shown in the American documentary is really impressive. Such heavy tubing with cast iron hand valves are commonly used for piping large amounts of chemical liquids or pressurized gas. The design of this tubing was investigated by the French officer Capitaine Fribourg a week after the camp's liberation. Here is a sketch drawn by him showing how the piping worked. According to this, fresh air was sucked in through this intake vent, which protrudes through the roof. This intake pipe is subsequently led through a heat exchanger located over the gas chamber in the building's attic. Here, the air is heated by the building's hot water heating system. After that, the now insulated pipe is split into 2 and led out of the attic area into the room behind the gas chamber, where both pipes are led in a semicircle, each of which equipped with the hand valve shown. Leading back into the attic area over the gas chamber, Fribourg shows the pipes being merged back into the outgoing pipe, but that would make no sense at all, because then the air would go nowhere. Therefore, that's a mistake. In fact, a report compiled by German architect Axel Wiel in the early 2000s, a copy of which we received from the Dachau Museum, described in detail that the layout actually looked like this. Wiel wrote, "Air is drawn in via a pipeline of 400 millimeters diameter extending over the roof, and is then led through a steam-operated heat exchanger. This pipeline is insulated behind the heat exchanger. It is split into 2 lines by means of a Y-branch pipe and leads with 2 pipes of 200 millimeters diameter into the room adjoining the gas chamber. There, the airflow can be adjusted with a valve each. Both these and the other 2 valves of the ventilation system are made of massive cast iron and carry a $sign in a circle. Such valves are common in gas pipelines, but not in ventilation systems. Behind the valves, both pipelines are again led back into the attic area above the gas chamber and merged back together into one pipe. This pipe enters a sheet metal shaft, which again goes through the adjoining room and leads the heated air to the air intake at the floor of the gas chamber. This sheet metal shaft is not insulated. This raises questions. Design logic suggests that this shaft would be the suitable location to add substances, such as Zyklon B, to the heated area prior to entering the gas chamber. The examination of the sheet metal shaft has so far not revealed any opening for such a manipulation, yet the missing insulation points to such a possibility. So much for architect Ville. The air exhaust system starts with 2 openings in the ceiling. From there, the 2 non-insulated exhaust pipes merge into one, and are led toward the wall to the room behind the gas chamber, where the pipe splits up into 2 again. Then it is led outside in a semicircle equipped with 2 hand valves, and led back into the attic area, where it is merged again into 1 pipe, as can be seen in this photo taken in the attic of that building. Then that merged pipe is fed into the electric blower that drives the whole operation, here visible in another attic photo, and from there out to the exhaust chimney which exits the roof here. Now, if that gas chamber was meant to be operated with Zyklon B, it would have been smart, as architect Ville correctly suggested, to equip the sheet metal shaft running down the wall of the adjacent room with some trap door, hinted at here with blue lines, allowing for Zyklon B to be inserted into some kind of basket inside the shaft, hinted at here with the red meshwork. That way, the constant stream of warm air would have evaporated the poison gas quickly and would have spread it out inside the room rapidly. But, as architect Ville correctly observed in his report, there is no trace of any provision to that effect. So, the poison was neither administered using the false shower heads, as the congressional report claimed, nor using the ventilation system, as the U.S. documentary that was shown during the Nuremberg Tribunal suggested. But how else could it have been done? Here's the story as we are told today.
They would pour Zyklon B down these slots right here and onto the floor.
Flaps where poison gas pellets named Zyklon B could be inserted from the outside.
Here are some photos of these slots from the inside and from the outside. So, the entire sophisticated ventilation system did not serve any other purpose than moving air around. Why, then, was it so complicated? It makes no sense at all. It would have been much easier to simply feed the heated air directly into the shaft going into the chamber, as shown here, and to feed the exhaust pipes directly into the blower, using the blower's speed to adjust for any needed change in air volume. For now, this entire ventilation system seems to be a nonsensical mystery. But that's not the only one. Fact is that neither the congressional report nor the post-war documentary mentions these Zyklon B slots. In fact, David Chavez, the main author of the congressional report, had compiled an earlier version of this report that did not get submitted. It stated, gas chamber, gas-tight doors, wooden shed believed to contain pump or compressor. This wooden shed, located just outside the alleged gas chamber, can be seen in many photos and film footages shot right after the liberation. It was located where today the 2 Zyklon B slots are located. But according to Chavez, it did not contain any slots, but rather some not clearly identified equipment. The French officer, Capitaine Fribourg, describing the facility on May 25, 1945, as he claims to have seen it on May 5, 1945, hence a week after the camp's capture by the Americans, also mentioned the wooden shed as follows. Right next to the shower room, adjacent to the building, is a palisade some 2 meters high, fencing off a space of 2 meters wide. It was not possible to get inside due to the presence of a pile of decomposing corpses stacked up against the palisade, and behind the palisade is said to have existed or exists a compressor group. He also described 2 slots in the wall obscured by this shed from the outside as follows. At about 75 centimeters from the ground, 2 hoppers connect the shower room with the outside, palisade side. Each hopper ends on the inside with a grate, and on the outside with a movable shutter system. That's also what we see there today. Fribourg even concluded those hoppers in one of his sketches. If we look at the outside of this wall in that location today, we can see these strange features. It may have been the electrical outlet for the device operated in that shed. Looking closer at the Zyklon B slots, we notice that the mortar around them is not original. The original mortar used to build Barrack X contains coarse gravel rather than sand, while any mortar used around the Zyklon B slots, and on later repairs and patch-ups, as we can see them here, are made of mortar containing fine sand. Here we can even see how some of the new mortar flowed over the old mortar. On the inside, it is apparent that the tiles around those slots have been damaged. In fact, a simple test with the fingernail shows that these rough surfaces aren't even tiles. They are plaster made to look similar to the tiles around them. In other words, those slots are not part of the original building. They were added later on by hacking holes through the existing wall. Who did that change, and when was it done? Chavez didn't mention them, and neither did the U.S. documentary on Dachau of May 3rd. Freeborg saw them 2 days later, but he did not claim that they were used to throw in Zyklon B. That wouldn't have been a good idea anyway, because a large amount of the gypsum pellets would have gotten stuck on the grill on the inside. But what were those slots used for? Or is it a post-war forgery? And if that is so, what else is? Here's one hint. This footage was recorded on October 25, 2017, from the website of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. When searching their video archive for the term gas chamber, the first result is this video. It's titled, Exhumation, Inspection of Gas Chambers, Lieutenant Hodges. This is footage taken after the liberation of Paris of an alleged Gestapo torture chamber near the Eiffel Tower. In the description, we read, World War II interiors of gas chamber used by the Germans in the execution of prisoners, demonstrating method of securing prisoners in gas chambers, various close-ups, pipes leading into room, and handprints and scratches dug into cement wall of gas chamber by the victims. Here are those ominous pipes. They are rather fancy, but not very functional. Most of all, they would have been within reach of the victims and wouldn't have survived very long, because they would have been demolished very quickly. Also, notice all those windows illuminating this room. How long would those window panes have lasted if the victims inside trashed the place and tried to break out? For that footage, they even pumped some innocuous but dramatic-looking smoke through the pipes. Here are the handprints in the cement allegedly created by gassing victims during their death throes. Needless to say, handprints can only be made in fresh mortar, and only insane people would use a room as an execution chamber whose walls had just been plastered. These gas pipes and handprints are not evidence of Nazi atrocities. They are evidence of a deliberate Allied psychological warfare campaign to demonize the defeated Germans. Because this hoax is so obvious, no mainstream historian has ever taken that claim seriously. That does not prevent the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum from presenting it to an unsuspecting audience, though. Unfortunately, most people just accept whatever the government, media, or religion tell them to believe. So, what was necessary for the Americans, who had liberated Paris several months earlier, to create that footage? First of all, they must have had a plan. Then they must have had at their disposal the necessary hardware to create the film set, pipes, smoke-generating devices, and some workers able to install that hardware and to create a cement wall with handprints. In contrast to that utterly unknown Gestapo torture chamber in Paris, Dachau was one of the best-known German concentration camps. It was the first one to be opened right after the Nazis came to power. When the Americans finally moved in April 1945, this camp had dominated the fantasy of Nazi opponents for more than a decade. So, did the American psychological warfare executives have a plan? You bet they did. And did they come with hardware and workers to put that plan into action? If they did it in Paris in January 1945, they surely were even more likely to pull it off at Dachau, which was a much more promising propaganda stage. So, let me ask again, why are these fanciful pipes in Dachau so impressive and even intimidating, but at the same time so completely useless and pointless? Before we jump to conclusions, let's look at some wartime documents. First, there are the two photos shown earlier taken sometime in 1944. On both, we can see the ventilation chimney that's part of the gas chamber's aeration system. So at least that exhaust chimney was built by the Germans prior to the end of the war. Next, among the few original documents available on that building, there are two blueprints of special interest. This one shows a cross-section through the gas chamber. It shows that the ceiling is indeed only some 7 feet high, not 10 feet, as the rest of the building. Next, a section enlargement of this document shows the floor plan of the gas chamber. As we can see, both doors are 90 centimeters wide and consist either of 2 doors each, one opening inward, the other outward, or of a swinging door. Either way, such an arrangement would not have been suitable for a gas chamber, as swinging doors could neither be made gas-tight nor panic-proof. And in case this layout consisted of two doors, the inner one opening inward could not have been opened if dead bodies were piled up against it inside the chamber. Such an arrangement is actually common for morgues. For instance, the blueprints of the morgue in the old crematorium at Auschwitz show the same type of door design. Today, this room is equipped with two heavy steel doors of the type that were quite common for air raid shelters. The doors are 1 meter wide and set in steel frames, the same doors as shown in the U.S. footage recorded on May 3, 1945, hence just 5 days after the camp was captured by the Americans. They were therefore most likely built in there long before the Americans arrived. Also, one of the walls actually consists of 2 layers with a hollow space in between, which is typically used as insulation, something also seen in the above-mentioned Auschwitz morgue. Hence, it looks like this room was initially meant to serve as a morgue. In fact, the striking feature of this building is that, if we discard the idea that this alleged gas chamber served as a morgue, this building has no other room of a suitable size equipped with a ventilation system. But if that is so, what about the weird, oversized piping? And what about those heavy doors? And what about the shafts on the outside, evidently added after the building was completed? And what about the peephole in the rear wall, which Captain Freeburg described in his report? He even drew a sketch of it. It slanted rather steeply downward, hence it wouldn't have allowed anyone to see anything except for maybe the feet of a few people standing or lying close to that hole. The hole inside that gas chamber that is said to have been the other end of that peephole can be seen to this day, although it is way higher than what Freeburg reported, who in his sketch placed the peephole below the second little port visible on that wall, close to the floor. Today, neither the peephole's exit nor the switches are visible in the adjoining room. The switch panel and switch box are shown in the footage recorded on May 3, 1945, for the U.S. documentary, but that documentary neither shows nor mentions that peephole. There is, however, a photograph of that area from May 1945 showing not only the switch panel and the switch box, plus some of the insulated pipes and hand valves, but also a crude opening in the wall just beneath the switch panel. If we compare that image with a still of the footage just shown, we see, A, that the lid of the switch box to the left has disappeared, B, and more importantly, the upper rugged edge of the hole in the photo should also be visible in the still, but it isn't. Therefore, somebody must have hacked that hole in there after the documentary was shot. Here's how that hole looks on the inside, seen from the gas chamber. It does indeed angle upward. In the background, you see bricks and mortar used by the museum to close up that gaping hole in the adjoining room. Inside this tube runs an electric cable put in there when the room was prepared as a museum exhibit. What we see here is the fact that, since the camp's liberation on April 29, 1945, quite a few people seem to have tampered with the evidence of this suspected crime scene. It's difficult to assess what this hole was really used for. A peephole, however, would have been installed in the doors, as was and is common for air raid shelter doors, rather than hacked through a thick brick wall, and it most certainly would not have slanted downward. So, is the Dachau gas chamber a post-war fraud? Considering that the camp was liberated on April 29th and that the gas chamber was inspected by 4 members of the U.S. Congress only 3 days later, on May 2nd, this seems to be not enough time for a major fraud. In fact, there is evidence pointing in a different direction. Most importantly, there is a letter in the German Federal Archives by Dr. Zygmunt Rascher to Heinrich Himmler dated August 9, 1942, which reads, quote, "As you know, the same facility as at Linz is being built at the Dachau concentration camp. Since the transports of invalids end up in certain chambers anyway, I ask whether the effect of our various combat gases can be tested on people who are destined for that anyway. So far, all we have are experiments with animals or reports on accidents during the production of these gases. Because of this paragraph, I am sending my letter marked secret," unquote. Dr. Rascher was the infamous doctor who conducted medical experiments on inmates at Dachau, which were among the crimes prosecuted by the American occupational powers after the war in the famous medical case of the Nuremberg trials of war criminals. While there was plenty of evidence for a variety of experiments on human guinea pigs, such as exposure to low air pressure and extended submersion in cold water, tests of combat gases at Dachau were not among the charges. There was simply too little evidence to make that case. We may speculate that Dr. Roscher had indeed tried to re-rig the morgue of Barrack X for the potential testing of combat gases, with those shafts perhaps simply serving as air intake shafts for better ventilation, since the room had no windows. But since Dr. Roscher was arrested by the German police in April 1944 and eventually executed for a number of crimes, child abduction and murder among them, that project, if it ever existed, ended up being abandoned at that point at the latest. When the Americans arrived a year later, the room was nothing more than a morgue, filled with the victims of diseases and malnutrition, which could not be cremated due to the lack of fuel. For the time being, any answer to the question what these strange objects were meant for remains speculation to a large degree, because almost the entire original paperwork regarding the planning and construction of that building, cost estimates, progress reports, blueprints, invoices, etc., have disappeared from the Dachau camp archives. Only a few, not very informative documents are left, such as the ones we just saw, plus a few others. So, either the Nazis destroyed them because they had something to hide, or the Americans confiscated and/or destroyed them because they wanted to prevent anyone from figuring out what that room really looked like and was used for. At Dachau, imagery of a gas chamber disguised as a shower room was driven into our minds. Dachau is where the world came to believe the rumors and saw what we believed to be evidence of well-engineered German machinery capable of gassing with precision and efficiency. So, if that gas chamber wasn't what we are told, or at least wasn't used at all for mass executions, why were there massive amounts of clothes hanging in its vicinity when the Americans arrived?
Hanging in orderly rows were the clothes of prisoners who had been suffocated in a lethal gas chamber. They had been persuaded to remove their clothing under the pretext of taking a shower, for which towels and soap were provided.
Actually, these are clothes airing outside the Dachau disinfestation chambers. The narrator merely claims that this is the clothing of homicidal gas chamber victims. Then they deceptively cut to the shower room door, making the viewer believe they are the same door, the one with the obvious written gas warnings on it, and the supposed gas chamber, disguised as a shower room, designed to trick those entering. The hoaxers showed film of these disinfestation gas chambers for fumigating clothes located at the end of the building. They claim these doors, clearly marked with warning signs and skull and crossbones, were used to gas prisoners. This is where the disinfestation chambers are, and the doors clearly marked with warnings. But the, quote, shower room, the alleged gas chamber, is located a few rooms away. The deception was to trick the average viewer into thinking the clearly marked delousing chamber door with skull and crossbones located at the end of the building was the same as the shower room door. This dirty deception continues to this day. For example, take this 2012 documentary on Dachau by filmmaker Levi Mirau. After showing the gas chamber and describing how it allegedly worked, he too deceptively cuts to the disinfestation chamber while continuing his narration about homicidal gassing. Watch it.
A door labeled showered bath led into a large room which was meant to deceive, since the room was not actually a shower room, but a gas chamber. The room consisted of outlets in the walls, floor, and roof.
Stop! Outlets in the floor and roof? These shower heads weren't an outlet for anything, and those 6 drains in the floor are actually real drains, which indicates that the room was originally designed to handle a lot of water, not gas. Fast forwarding a few seconds, we have this footage.
Flaps where poison gas pellets named Zyklon B could be inserted from the outside. Since the gas chambers were only built during the camp's last months, only 7 were killed in the gas chambers, used as test subjects.
So while showing the disinfestation chambers, Levis deceptively talks about gas chambers, in the plural, used to kill 7 people. The same kind of deception is committed by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on its website. View of the door of the gas chamber at Dachau. An American soldier stands outside of the gas chamber in Dachau. View of the door to the gas chamber at Dachau next to a large pile of uniforms. The door to the gas chamber in Dachau. It is marked shower bath. View of the door to the gas chamber in the Dachau concentration camp. A sign above it identifies it as a shower. The U.S. Holocaust Museum uses the singular the to imply both of these doors were the same door of the same homicidal gas chamber disguised as a shower room. They show the outside of the clothing fumigation chamber doors, located at the end of the building, then show the inside of the shower room door, located all the way over here. There are 4 disinfestation chambers, not one, but they chose photographs which show one door and use the singular the and mix it with images of the shower room. You can see the disinfestation chambers had warnings not to enter and marks designating when clothing fumigation started and when it was safe to open the doors again. Here they refer to this as a gas chamber, of course ignoring that it was one of the 4 used to delouse clothing. The photograph's caption reveals the early propaganda lies, still perpetrated today. Gas room. People were hung up in here. These hooks were not used to hang people in gas chambers. They were just hooks for clothing, of course. View of the hooks outside the door to the gas chambers in Buchenwald. First, this isn't even Buchenwald. This is a photo of a Dachau delousing chamber. The original caption reads, Buchenwald was the home of Ilse Koch, wife of the commandant. She was known as the Bitch of Buchenwald, an insult to every dog who ever lived. She had her inmates tattooed in various designs, then had them killed, then skinned, and their hides tanned to make bookbindings, lampshades, and other articles. I saw these things. One story has it that she enjoyed sexual intercourse with her victims. This may be apocryphal. These meat hooks were used on the bodies of humans. Just about every claim in this miscaptioned photo is false. This example illuminates the typical hysterical propaganda common at the time and still repeated today by a government-funded institution. In reality, these alleged meat hooks are just hangers for clothes to air out after passing through the fumigation chambers. This complex machinery sure looked like it would be something we'd expect in German-designed death chambers, but because this equipment could not be used to introduce Zyklon B fumes into the chamber, today we are told the Germans instead just dumped the pesticide pellets onto the room's floor through these vents in the outside wall. This is quite odd because the disinfestation chambers right down the hall actually did have advanced, specially designed mechanisms to properly heat and circulate cyanide gas from the Zyklon B pesticide pellets. This was called the Digesh circulatory device made by the manufacturer of Zyklon B. A member of a clothing fumigation crew would put a can of Zyklon B into the holder. A built-in can opener operated from the outside with a crank would open the can. The pellets would drop down a chute into a basket where hot air would be blown through to speed the release of cyanide gas from the pellets. The pesticide would be spread throughout the clothing fumigation chamber, and when finished, the gas would be removed from the chamber and fresh air blown in. One should be very skeptical upon learning that today the official story is that the Germans, rather than using something like this specially designed device used in the clothing delousing chambers right down the hall, simply poured Zyklon B pellets through holes in the wall. Such a procedure would have been very detrimental, because once those pellets were inside the room, they could not have been removed, unless the room had been cleared of all the corpses. Since Zyklon B releases its poison for an hour or more, depending on temperature and humidity, this means that any effort to swiftly ventilate the room after an execution would have been in vain. Hence, these shafts, if they were added during the war within the framework of Dr. Roscher's testing frenzy, may simply have been designed to assist the ventilation of that room. Anyway, this is not exactly the advanced German engineering we are constantly propagandized with, is it? In the face of overwhelming evidence that this room was never used to gas anyone, mainstream historians now claim that the inmates employed to build this gas chamber managed to sabotage its completion by dawdling on the job for some 3 years. Or so we read in the original French edition of Paul Bourbon's official history of the camp. Quote, "The Dachau gas chamber, however, never functioned because, to a certain extent, it seems, of sabotage carried out by the team of prisoners given the job to build it." So, the narration of the Nuremberg trial evidence film Nazi concentration camps was completely wrong. This clothing did not belong to inmates suffocated in the gas chamber. This was just clothing which passed through the real gas chambers for delousing clothes and was airing out. This deceptive narration of the Dachau segment is an important part of the falsehoods in the Nuremberg trial's film evidence centerpiece. This bizarre practice of calling shower rooms gas chambers continues to this day. We can see on the website of Israel's Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem, a photograph of the actual inmate shower room at the Dachau camp, captioned, "A gas chamber after the liberation." This is just another real shower. Flossenburg, Germany, gas chambers, which were called showers. This claim is repeated on the History Whiz website, The Final Solution. The photograph is captioned, "The final destination for those who could not work, the gas chamber. Here, the gas chamber at Flossenburg." The hoaxers pulled the same old trick angle in the camera to block out the many windows of this real working shower room. The top official authorities today concede this room was a real shower, never used to gas anyone. Moreover, no mainstream historian has ever claimed that there was a homicidal gas chamber at the Flossenburg camp. This doesn't stop Israel's Holocaust Museum and others from spreading gas shower nonsense. The History Whiz website presents an important quote, "To be ignorant of history is to remain always a child." Cicero. That certainly holds true for those who childishly and ignorantly believe showers were gas chambers. A major reason we believed in the stories of the showers of death is the terrible images of corpses taken at the end of the war. But those horrific images of emaciated and dead prisoners are not proof of an extermination program.
This special presentation of The Oprah Winfrey Show is brought to you with limited commercial interruption. It is supported in part by the new AT&T, committed to education.
I'm here in Poland at the Auschwitz death camp, where it's estimated that 1.1 to 1.5 million people perished here in the Holocaust.
At an early age, you are probably already exposed to a program like this. Documentaries such as this one are specifically aimed at young people. You can even see this copy was taken from a website called SchoolTube. Videos like this shock their audience by showing atrocious imagery, which, if it were fiction, would be rated unsuitable for children.
That evil has a name: the Holocaust. A systematic mass murder meticulously planned and executed by Nazi Germany that brutally wiped millions of people off the face of the earth. More than 6 million of those human beings were Jewish.
But since this imagery is real, it is not rated unsuitable for children, although it is even more traumatizing exactly because it is real. However, hardly anyone, let alone a child, has the ability or experience to analyze the context of this imagery. This horrific film footage of emaciated corpses is presented with no context other than the claim that they are proof of a systematic extermination policy.
The Holocaust. A systematic mass murder meticulously planned and executed.
These images, however, were taken at the very end of the war. Mainstream historians claim, however, that any extermination activity had ceased in those camps in October of 1944 at the latest, based on an affidavit by German SS officer Kurt Becker, in which he quoted an order allegedly issued by Himmler in September of 1944 as follows: "I prohibit any annihilation of Jews with immediate effect, and, on the contrary, order the nursing of weak and sick persons. I hold you," with this Kaltenbrunner and Pohl were meant, "personally responsible for this, even if this order is not strictly followed by subordinate departments." Both Kaltenbrunner and Pohl were top officials of the concentration camp system. No trace of that Himmler order has ever been found, but that's beside the point I want to make here. When we look at what was really going on in those camps, we are in for a surprise. Here's a chart showing the number of inmate deaths at Dachau, as recorded first by the German authorities and then by the Americans. It clearly shows that mortality exploded at a time when Hitler's extermination policy is said to have been abandoned. The same happened at the Bergen-Belsen camp, where mortality exploded only in early 1945, as can be seen from this chart exhibited today at the Bergen-Belsen Museum. The reason for that was severe overcrowding, combined with the disastrous collapse of food and water supplies, as well as medical care and hygienic measures, which taken together caused malnutrition, starvation, and fatal diseases such as typhus and dysentery to spread out of control. In those months, the Allies bombed Germany's entire infrastructure to smithereens, including the supply lines into the camps. Shipments of medicine, sanitation supplies, and food into the camps, power plants, and water treatment plants were systematically bombed, and in some cases, they even bombed the actual camps. Not only Jewish concentration camp prisoners struggled and perished during the final months of World War II. For month upon month, the German civilian population was the target of an unprecedented firebombing campaign by the Western Allies. From Hamburg to Dresden, tens of thousands of innocent German civilians were deliberately targeted and murdered. Women and children were burned alive, and terrified families suffocated from poison gas in bomb shelters. They don't ever show you these pictures, do they? You should ask why, though. Anyway, many Germans who survived became refugees running for their lives and also struggled to feed themselves. In the East, German civilian populations were also fleeing the invading Soviet army, which was torturing and murdering civilians en masse. The Red Army raped untold numbers of German women, from young children to the elderly. Using these horrific images, the catastrophic last days of a collapsing Germany surrounded on all sides and bombed to smithereens as proof of deliberate extermination camps is the dirty trick that is the main reason people believe in the Holocaust. It's why many react strongly against those critically investigating mainstream Holocaust claims. After all, we all saw the bodies, right? These images were taken in camps liberated by the Western Allies, primarily Dachau, liberated by the Americans, and Bergen-Belsen, liberated by the British, camps which are today admitted, even by mainstream historians, not to have served as extermination or death camps. Today, all of the so-called death camps or extermination camps are claimed to have been in Polish territories conquered by the Soviet Union. Early witnesses originally claimed these Western-liberated camps also had homicidal gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. However, British and American doctors performed thousands of autopsies on some of the corpses the Allies discovered in those camps. Russell Barton, an English medical student who had spent a month in Belsen after the camp's liberation and had investigated the reasons for the camp's disastrous conditions toward the end of the war, stated, quote, "German medical officers told me that it had been increasingly difficult to transport food to the camp for some months. Anything that moved on the autobahns was likely to be bombed. I was surprised to find records, going back for 2 or 3 years, of large quantities of food cooked daily for distribution. I became convinced, contrary to popular opinion, that there had never been a policy of deliberate starvation. This was confirmed by the large numbers of well-fed inmates. The major reasons for the state of Belsen were disease, gross overcrowding by central authority, lack of law and order within the huts, and inadequate supplies of food, water, and drugs." Here's an interview Dr. Barton gave to the late Ernst Zundel some 10 years after this article had been published.
You were on the scene in Belsen as a young man.
Yes, I went with a group of medical students, and we arrived in Belsen on May the 2nd, 1945, and I first went to the camp on May the 3rd. Himmler ordered the camp to be seeded on April the 11th in order to stop typhus, which was an epidemic spreading throughout Europe. The British came in, the tank division came in on April the 15th at 3 o'clock. And they did their best to segregate the typhus and the dying from the others.
How many people were in the camp at the time when the British took over the camp?
I think there were about 57 or 60,000. The British bombed everything, and the Americans that moved on the roads. So that getting food there was extremely difficult. the water supplies became contaminated with sewage, and the administration in the camp more or less broke down. The distribution of food in the individual huts was left to the inmates. And the inmates, we found out, we were fooled at first, but this was after May, after I got there. The inmates, if one particular group was in control, they would take what they wanted and then leave whatever food was over to the rest of the hut. So that meant perhaps 10 powerful people would gobble everything and 350 would have whatever was left. Oh, they were all, I say all nationalities, mainly Polish and Russian. Most of them were Jewish.
Were there men and women?
Yes, there were men and women. And children.
And were they segregated? Segregated camps. And that was still segregated when you got there? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. Even, let's say, if the German camp administration had made maximum effort and had been given everything at hand, could they have prevented this?
There was no cure for typhus at that time. The British put DDT, which is an insecticide, over everything and everybody. And in that way, I think the typhus was contained. But it was a great danger. People don't realise it was typhus. I suppose 50-60% of people died who got it.
Why are these bodies naked? I mean, some of them are so emaciated. Why don't they have their clothing on?
Well, they did, and when they were pushed outside of the huts, they had clothing on, but clothing was so scarce, everything was scarce, that the inmates would immediately rush out and take all the clothing off because it was a pity to waste it. That's why they were naked.
Did you see, when you got there 2 weeks after the British Army took over, any evidence of gas chambers, the way propaganda has said that the Germans had in these camps, or was there any claim made to that effect?
No, I don't think it was ever thought that there was a gas chamber in Belsenberg. People were dying at 500 a day, by the way, rate 500 a day.
Even under British administration?
Under British administration, yes. And what was happening was that the English soldiers were giving people their food, and people half starved and had very thin stomachs, and the stomach would burst and they'd die. The inmates said that conditions there, this was what the inmates said, that conditions weren't too bad until the end of 44, and then this mass immigration. But by the time they put in another 50,000, of course.
Were you there during the time when the bulldozers were actually putting these bodies in the graves? In these long trenches that we see in
the bodies were being thrown in. The truck went round every day and picked up the bodies outside the hut. Mm-hmm. And then they were taken to where the bulldozer had dug the grave, and they were thrown into the grave.
You are a man born in England. You published this article, I believe, for an English publication in the London Times. Picked up on what you had published here?
That's right. This was published in November 1968. I was asked to write it. I was solicited. I had no intention of so doing.
And nobody ever interviewed you from any German magazines or papers?
Oh, no.
To this day?
Not to this day.
Did anybody ever officially from Germany come and contact you for a kind of a historical documentation, like they have got these archives in Koblenz and places like that?
No.
Never.
Similar to this is the account given by Dr. Charles Larson, a U.S. forensic pathologist working for the U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General. Right after the war, Dr. Larson performed autopsies on hundreds of victims in some 20 former concentration camps. In 1980, a newspaper article appeared reporting about his wartime experience. We read there, Larson has talked little publicly about the war experience. One reason for his silence has been that his autopsy findings conflicted with the widely held belief that most Jews in Nazi camps were exterminated by gassing, shooting, or poisoning. What we've heard is that 6 million Jews were exterminated. Part of that is a hoax, Larson said. Never was a case of poison gas uncovered, he said. Larson's biographer wrote the following about this episode, quote, "In one grave, the bulldozers uncovered an estimated 2,000 bodies, many of which were subjected to autopsy examination by Major Larson. All of those autopsied had died of various conditions, such as emaciation with starvation, tuberculosis, typhus, or other infectious diseases. For the next 10 days, many nights with only an hour or two of restless sleep, Larson worked among the dead. He performed about 25 autopsies a day and superficially examined another 300 to 1,000 bodies. He autopsied only those bodies that appeared to have died questionably. Many of them died of typhus, Dr. Larson told me recently. At Dachau, Larson's work, the profile of the prisoner population that his autopsies projected, indicated that only a small percentage of the deaths were due to medical experimentation on humans. It indicated that most of the victims died from so-called natural causes at the time, that is, of disease brought on by malnutrition and filth, which are the handmaidens of war. Today, these particular camps are admitted not to have had homicidal gas chambers at all. So, none of the corpses seen in these images were gassed. What you see in these images are prisoners who died from disease, as well as a lack of appropriate food, water, and medical supplies. A large part of their condition was due to the Allies bombing supply lines to the camps. Allied fighter planes even bombed and strafed trainloads full of prisoners as they were being evacuated to different camps. Those prisoners who weren't hit by bullets or bombs were without appropriate supplies for days until arriving at their destination. The liberation of Dachau concentration camp is dramatized in the film Shutter Island. The Americans liberating Dachau came across what became known as, quote, the Dachau death trains, unquote. They saw bullet holes in the sides of the trains and dead prisoners inside in terrible condition. Believing the Germans locked starved prisoners inside the trains, then machine-gunned them, the Americans turned their fury to the capture of German guards.
The guards surrendered. We took their guns. We lined them up. It wasn't warfare, it was murder.
Many of the German guards who surrendered the camp had only recently been transferred to the camp in the final days of the war. Some were just teenagers from surrounding towns. Ironically, this young German guard even looks like the young DiCaprio. This young German was not a deliberate Holocauster of Jews or anyone else, but a young man tragically swept into the final days of the most brutal war in the history of mankind. The German soldiers surrendered, and with their hands up, the Americans shot dozens of captured, unarmed German guards. And it didn't happen in the heat of the moment either, as this movie suggests. In fact, the Americans actually brought the guards to the camp's coal yard, got a heavy machine gun from their vehicle and brought it into position, and they had their army photographers take pictures of the event. As this photo and others prove, it was a war crime. The Americans played judge, jury, and executioner. They even dragged German soldiers from a nearby hospital and shot them, even though they had nothing to do with the camp at all, let alone the death trains. Here is the testimony of one of the Americans involved in this murder.
I was not prepared for what I saw in Dachau. Nothing could prepare you for that. Nothing could prepare you for that type of slaughter that was carried on in that camp. I never like to see people killed unnecessarily, no matter what their stripe is or what they have done. And we did kill some people there that I considered unnecessarily. However, given the circumstances, I'm sorry about it. It was just one of those things that no one could control. Actually, the people that we killed died a much easier death than the people that they tortured and killed, as we subsequently found out. Torture and and hangings and execution in various manners was a daily occurrence. So in a way we were kinder to them than they were to the people that they murdered.
The only problem is that the people he helped to kill were not those who had run the camp for many years. But evidence has come to light that the Germans did not lock prisoners inside the trains and machine gun them. The bullets which tore through the trains full of prisoners were not German bullets, but in fact the result of Allied warplanes strafing the trains. Here's a Jewish former prisoner talking about the Allies bombing and shooting his train, killing prisoners on the way to Dachau, explaining their condition.
I was ordered to go marched out to the railroad station and back into the cattle cars, but this time they had open wagons and regular cattle cars. But the only difference was that the railroad tracks, on one track the Nazis were retreating with the heavy artillery, ammunition and all their hardware, and another track the concentration camp inmates in the train road. The Nazis were hoping maybe because we are there they will not be bombed. It would have been a short trip, but it took us almost 3 days to get to Dachau. What had happened, we got hit by air raid. They bombed both of the tracks. They machine gunned our train. And in the train where I was sitting, this time it wasn't so loaded. We were all squatting down. Both of the fellow beside me got hit by machine gun fire. And I just dazed. By then the guards were gone. We opened the railroad car and stumbled out of the car and walked into the woods nearby and hid there. I remember going out on the fields and dug up some potatoes for food. But they came back next morning or a day later with dogs, gathered us together and ordered us back to the railroad cars. They never removed the bodies. This is how we arrived to Dachau.
This Jew's train was bombed and shot by Allied planes. The prisoners the Allies killed were left inside the train. Prisoners who weren't blown up or shot by the Allies suffered further malnutrition, in part due to the bombing of train tracks, delaying their journey. The Allies were directly responsible for killing many on these death trains. Bullets from Allied airplanes tore through the bodies of those prisoners. Shortly before the American infantry arrived at Dachau, American infantry, ignorant of the role of Allied bombing and strafing runs contributing to the deaths of the prisoners inside the death trains, put the blame on the Germans. They lined the unarmed, surrendered German guards against a wall and executed them, committing a war crime which has gone unpunished to this day. Misunderstandings, propaganda, falsehoods, blind patriotism, mistakes, rushing to judgment. How else could millions be driven to killing their own people, themselves essentially?
It wasn't warfare, it was murder.
The Allies also directly bombed concentration camp prisoners, and today we are told this is proof of a German-planned Holocaust. This is another segment from the American propaganda film Nazi Concentration Camps, which was shown at the Nuremberg trials.
The slave labor camp at Nordhausen, liberated by the 3rd Armored Division, 1st Army. At least 3,000 political prisoners died here at the brutal hands of SS troops and pardoned German criminals who were the camp guards. Nordhausen had been a depository for slaves found unfit for work in the underground V-bomb plants and in other German camps and factories.
A deceptively captioned image of Nordhausen appears in Steven Spielberg's The Last Days companion book. We see American soldiers walking past corpses strewn on the ground. The caption reads, "The horrific scene of mass annihilation within the Nordhausen concentration camp." Let's look closer at the photograph. We can see the buildings have been bombed. Testimony of former prisoners shows they were lucky to survive Allied bombing attacks. This Jewish former prisoner and doctor describes prisoners laying in the camp hospital sick of tuberculosis in the final days of the war.
And there I had over 4,000 prisoners laying on tuberculosis. Sick. What are you doing with tuberculosis? No medications, nothing. Hardly food. It was very meager already. The Germans didn't have to eat.
This former prisoner and doctor described conditions in the camp in the final days of the war. Sick prisoners didn't have enough supplies. However, he points out the Germans themselves also didn't have enough even to eat. Clearly, the Germans could have killed the sick prisoners at any time, yet instead treated them in hospitals.
And all of a sudden, it was April 3rd at 3 o'clock, alarm, and American Air Force over us, and dropped the bombs just on our camp. And the whole camp was entirely destroyed. And out of this 4,000 people, we were 200 survived. Because they died there, they were in the camps, hanging in the ceiling, dead bodies, and it was awful. It was burning days and days. We were still, if the nurses, the doctors, administration people who work in administration, we ran away. And the Americans made a mistake because they didn't know this is a concentration camp. They knew it is a military camp. They emptied the military a month before, and in January we put us in, you see. So they didn't know. So they came back at 9 o'clock in the morning and hit the whole city. The whole city they flattened. We ran away in the wood, in the fields, and when they emptied the planes, they came and strafed us with machine guns at them. They could know who it is. They are Germans, And we went into the wood, and we remained about a week in the woods. And we ate only the raw potatoes.
British Royal Air Force bombed the camp full of sick prisoners. They turned around and shot survivors running for their lives. They flattened the nearby town full of innocent German civilians. The British are primarily responsible for the scene of, quote, mass annihilation. But images of Nordhausen, recently bombed and strafed by British planes, are still used today as proof of a deliberate German-planned Holocaust. And it's important to note that most of those seen in this photograph aren't even Jews, but primarily non-Jewish political prisoners, including Poles, Russians, and Jehovah's Witnesses. These majority non-Jewish victims of Allied bombing at a former labor camp are used to sell a supposed Jewish Holocaust. The Oprah program deceptively used 2 shots of the aftermath of the British air raid at Nordhausen.
More than 6 million of those human beings were Jewish.
This victim of the Allies blowing up and strafing sick prisoners at Nordhausen being carried over rubble was in fact likely not Jewish. So we're looking at someone who is both not killed by the Germans, but by the British, and who is likely not a Jew. Here's another clip of Nordhausen. The prisoners of the camp for seriously ill prisoners were blown up and shot by the British, and were buried in this mass grave. The soldiers standing at the edge are Americans, but we are led to assume they are Germans, standing at attention after a job well done.
That brutally wiped millions of people off the face of the earth.
Actually, the British brutally wiped these prisoners off the face of the earth. The Germans put them in a camp with doctors and nurses. What's incredible is that you were shown these images as proof of an organized, planned, systematic extermination program going according to plan.
A systematic mass murder meticulously planned and executed.
When in reality, this was the result of the total disorganization and utter chaos of a collapsing Germany, which was still being bombed relentlessly into submission. Rather than do the right thing and accept blame for what could be said is accidental collateral damage based on faulty intelligence, the Allies instead just blamed the Germans. Images of a camp full of sick prisoners bombed and strafed by British planes at Nordhausen are used as proof of a systematic, planned German extermination program. However, every single mostly non-Jewish prisoner in this imagery was killed due to a British bomb or bullet. The editing of the film Nazi concentration camps was supervised by Bud Schulberg, born Seymour Schulberg, son of the head of Paramount Studios. Schulberg was Jewish and a member of the Communist Party USA until 1939. All of these dead were murdered by British bombs or bullets, yet no mention is made of that. Schulberg claims they died at the brutal hands of Germans.
At least 3,000 political prisoners died here at the brutal hands of SS troops and pardoned German criminals who were the camp guards.
This is a total lie, an inversion of history. The final shot of the Nazi concentration camps film shows footage of a prisoner at Nordhausen who had his head blown off. A prisoner account describes exactly how this happened and who is responsible. The April 3rd bombing. The accounts refer first of all to the Tuesday, April 3rd bombing. Right from the first blast, I took shelter under the concrete staircase of the Riviera. A bomb hit the block and the staircase was demolished. I ran to the middle of the camp to a shelter dug right into the ground, where there were already a dozen civilians, women, children, and also an SS man, as green from fear as his uniform, who could only stammer, "Schrecklich, schrecklich," horrible, horrible. And indeed, it was not a pretty sight. Corpses every 5 or 6 yards, headless, or their innards ripped open. Today, images of Nordhausen are widely used as proof of a Jewish Holocaust. Why is this particular image so popular? The bodies of those blown up or shot by the British, then pulled out of craters or the rubble of buildings and lined up in ordered rows by the Americans, are meant to imply an orderly German method of mass murder. Apparently, they want us to believe the Germans lined all those prisoners up here in neat rows and shot them where they stood. If these dead people were German soldiers, the Brits would pat themselves on the back for a job well done. Instead, the Allies just blame their bombing and shooting screw-up on the Germans. What a horrific scam, pulled right in front of our very eyes. Imagery of tragic deaths, which were the direct result of the Allies' actions, are cynically exploited to sell a lie.
Adolf Hitler was pure evil, and he was in command of the most advanced technology and the best disciplined people and the best educated people in the world.
In the wrong hands, technology helped turn Europe into a slaughterhouse. This was a war that was also a crime.
Eisenhower, when he first encountered concentration camps, was shocked and surprised. He hadn't been told about them. His immediate reaction was, this is so horrible that there will inevitably become a revisionist movement someday to say this never happened. This is propaganda. This is a figment of wartime imagination. So he insisted that every GI who could be marched through those camps, and he said, bring your cameras with you.
This is a classic quote used to attempt to refute revisionists. Eisenhower said there would be deniers in the future, so he ordered witnesses march through camps and film them. No one denies these are real bodies, but the false analysis of their cause of death, deflecting all blame onto Germans, is the propaganda. Every single shot in this news segment was taken at Nordhausen. All of the footage of murdered prisoners in the sick camp at Nordhausen shows prisoners blown up or shot by the British. This is another example of the propaganda formula. Supposed expert deceptive imagery, plus calling those who question it evil haters. It turns out this master historian was later accused of plagiarism throughout his entire career. He even lied about spending hundreds of hours with Eisenhower and meeting with him daily. Official records show he spent 5 hours on the record with Eisenhower. This is the mentality of these master historians, promoted to the forefront of the monopoly media. There was no plan to turn these prisoners into this condition. This was the result of the catastrophic end to the war, not everything going perfectly according to an evil plan. Up until this time, these images of a bulldozer dumping naked, emaciated corpses into a mass grave at Bergen-Belsen were the most horrifying imagery in the history of film. This film footage was shown to our grandparents' generation on a big screen. It has been shown to you at a young age. What are you to believe? Some programs, such as the Oprah presentation, lead one to assume this is a German driving this bulldozer, making his quota of gassed Jews for the day, rather than a British soldier pushing epidemic typhus victims into a mass grave. Until the end of the war, Bergen-Belsen was not a death camp where Germans deliberately starved to death and murdered prisoners. In fact, it was originally designated as a recuperation camp, or Krankenlager, where sick prisoners were sent to improve their health. It wasn't such a terrible place until the final days of the war, and there is evidence to prove it. Rose Kahn, a Hungarian Jew, was transported from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen in the summer of 1944. Before Auschwitz was abandoned and Bergen-Belsen was severely overcrowded, she describes Bergen-Belsen as not such a terrible place.
So when we arrived to Bergen-Belsen, and they told us to get out, and the Nazis came with those big dogs, with the wolves, and they asked us, who cannot walk, is sick, should tell him, so they're going to put us on a bus. I was afraid to say it. I couldn't walk, but I didn't say it. And if I would say, it would be good, because this was not a bad place. This was not, at that time.
So in other words, it wasn't a trick? They really would have taken you by bus?
Yes.
I think you were right.
Yeah, but I was so afraid. So my mother and my friends were holding me and helping. We had to walk a few miles, quite a few miles, to it. And we arrived there, and we lived in tents, tents and straw. We slept on straw, and we weren't treated badly. No, it wasn't too bad over there. We were giving nice meals. Nice. What happened? They wanted us strong to send out to work. So they didn't want weak and sick people.
Witnesses such as this help prove that Bergen-Belsen was not a specially designed death camp whatsoever. Before the catastrophic end of the war, prisoners were routinely fed and decently cared for. The major trick of the Holocaust promotion industry is to show these horrible images of emaciated bodies and make you believe that prisoners were always like this, that the Germans immediately starved them to death, and this deliberate starvation had been going on for years as part of their plan of extermination. However, witnesses such as this and others prove that at times the concentration camps were not so terrible.
This was not a bad place. This was not at that time.
It was only as Germany was losing the war, surrounded on all sides by a terror bombing campaign from the West and marauding Soviets in the East, that conditions in camps such as Bergen-Belsen deteriorated disastrously.
And then we stayed there till they started to build barracks for all the other Auschwitz people when Bergen-Belsen became hell.
Bergen-Belsen became hellish at the very end of the war. The major cause of this was the Allied bombing campaign, as the Allies firebombed German civilian population centers, burning innocent men, women, and children alive, and shot at or bombed just about anything that moved on roads or train tracks. Even the Germans themselves had trouble finding enough to eat at the time.
Hardly food. It was very meager already. The Germans didn't have to eat.
Food didn't improve very much because simple reason they didn't have it very much themselves. So,
did the civilians try to help you at all? Did they trade goods for things?
It's as I say, that we have almost everything what we wanted for that soccer teams from the civilians, from outside civilians.
The spread of deadly diseases and severe overcrowding exacerbated the entire situation. Prisoners from areas in the east, which were now being overrun by the Soviets, were hastily evacuated west. After days or weeks' journey, often on foot, they wound up in these overcrowded camps full of deadly diseases. And because the German infrastructure was being destroyed, this was catastrophic. In early February 1945, a large transport of Jews was admitted to Bergen-Belsen while the disinfestation facility was out of order. As a result, typhus broke out and quickly spread beyond control. The hot air delousing machine sometimes failed to work for several days. The worst killer was typhus, but typhoid fever and dysentery also claimed their lives. There was a breakdown in order and communication throughout the German system as the Germans were losing the war and fighting for their survival. Trainloads of food were destroyed by Allied planes. At Bergen-Belsen, the final factor which guaranteed mass casualties was in the final weeks of the war. The Allies bombed the power plant which supplied electricity to the facilities that pumped water to the camp.
Water, too, had been cut off. And so the water cart was the most important thing to arrive. There had been no water supply for 6 days. The Germans pleaded it had been cut.
The electric plant which powered pumps supplying water to Bergen-Belsen was not cut by some unnamed force. It was blown up by the British. A destroyed system for providing clean water to the camp compounded already disastrous hygiene and medical conditions. Clean water, necessary to shower prisoners, wash clothing, and treat dehydrated typhoid fever, dysentery, and typhus patients, was indeed cut off by British bombs.
One might ask why all the inmates surviving were not removed out of the camp altogether to a large town, for example, where there would be feeding and housing facilities. The answer is simply the dread word, typhus. A mobile bacteriological unit and all medical aid possible, together with 90 medical students from London hospitals, were rushed to the spot to deal with it. Lack of soap and water brought lice to the inmates, and lice carry typhus. To get rid of typhus, one must first get rid of lice. So contaminated patients were removed from their huts and put through a laundry process.
The British struggled to remedy disastrous conditions in Bergen-Belsen after liberation. Many thousands died after liberation. In the end, the British burned the wooden barracks as they became infested with deadly epidemic typhus-carrying body lice. Images of the disastrous situation at Bergen-Belsen are fraudulently used to portray a deliberate German extermination policy. These post-liberation images of Bergen-Belsen, as well as Dachau and Nordhausen, have become symbols of German barbarism. But these people were victims of the larger war, not a deliberate German extermination policy. The Germans did what they could to keep people alive, and in some cases contacted the Red Cross for assistance, and even turned over some camps to them. The shameful truth hidden amongst this Holocaust propaganda is that not only were none of these people gassed, but the Allies played a major role in their deaths. As terrible as these images of emaciated prisoners are, images of Union prisoners of the American Confederate Civil War camp Andersonville show liberated prisoners also appeared in a similar condition. What happened at Andersonville was a complete breakdown in hygiene measures due to inadequate sanitation facilities. Toilets in the overcrowded camp didn't drain properly, exposing prisoners to filth and disease, in particular dysentery. Symptoms of dysentery include diarrhea and rapid weight loss. In extreme cases, patients may pass over a liter of fluid per hour. It's easy to see how someone who is repeatedly defecating, vomiting, and urinating would quickly lose body weight, especially if food supplies, medicine, and water became scarce. At Andersonville, as overcrowding increased, so did the death toll. The Confederates also lost the war in a catastrophic way, much like the Germans. So there is a direct correlation between the images of Andersonville prisoners and the so-called Holocaust images. Now, these people at Andersonville aren't Jews, and never has anyone alleged that the South aimed for a total genocide of Northerners. The photographs of Andersonville and, for instance, Bergen-Belsen are quite similar and correlate with the breakdown in hygiene, overcrowding, the spread of disease, and one side of the war losing catastrophically. What you see in these images at Bergen-Belsen is primarily the result of typhus. Typhus is a disease carried by the body louse, which is similar to head lice. But body lice prefer to attach themselves not to the scalp, but to the inner seams of clothing. Typhus was responsible for the deaths of millions throughout history. Typhus epidemics routinely occurred throughout Europe during wartime. During World War I, more than 3 million people died from typhus. What you see in these images are primarily typhus epidemic victims. The Germans did not intentionally starve them to death. We can see several people liberated from the camps, Although not in pristine condition, some appear well fed, some even fat. They simply didn't have disease. The Germans, in fact, tried to stop the spread of disease. The insecticide Zyklon B was a pesticide used to kill these deadly typhus-carrying body lice. There's nothing inherently murderous about Zyklon B. In fact, Zyklon B was used on the Mexican border to gas the clothing of Mexicans crossing the border. The delousing process went like this. Prisoners entering a camp would strip their clothing and get a haircut to prevent any areas where deadly typhus-carrying body lice could thrive. Then they would take a hot shower. At the same time, their clothing would be put into specially designed fumigation chambers, where fumigation crews would use the insecticide Zyklon B to kill deadly typhus-carrying body lice. The prisoners would then be given clean, lice-free clothing and enter the camp. It is easy to see how this life-saving delousing process involving real fumigation chambers for clothing and real showers was misconstrued into wartime propaganda about showers of gas by prisoners spreading rumors, as well as Soviet propaganda artists deliberately framing their enemies. One of the final exhibits at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., sums up the importance of the information presented in this video. Museum visitors are bombarded with film clips taken after the Allies captured concentration and labor camps. These films are meant to represent proof of a deliberate German extermination policy. But you've now seen many of these clips explained and debunked. Near the end of the museum's main exhibit, 2 banks of 3 video monitors flanking a fallen Nazi flag play film footage taken after camps were captured by the Allies. Each of the 3 monitors is dedicated to one of the 3 major Allied powers, the Soviet Union, United States, and Great Britain. On this screen is U.S. Army footage taken at Nordhausen, Dachau, and Buchenwald. The caption reads, "Local German civilians are ordered to tour Buchenwald concentration camp." This is an American Army official gathering Germans around the supposed human skin lampshade and the table filled with propaganda props. Visitors are shown the Dachau death trains full of victims of Allied bombing and strafing attacks. Medonic, the outside of a real shower facility, Bath and Disinfection 2, and the inside of Bath and Disinfection 1, showing the real working shower room. Again, the camera is angled away from the many windows. The caption reads, "Soviet Army officers inspect chambers where prisoners were killed by poison gas." Today, every serious mainstream historian acknowledges this wasn't a gas chamber with fake shower heads. It was a real working shower room designed to keep prisoners alive and free of disease. Again, the bulldozer pushing epidemic typhus victims into a mass grave at Bergen-Belsen. A disaster, but not deliberate or planned. On the last television screen were shown footage of Nordhausen bombed to smithereens by 500 British warplanes over 2 days. Much like at the Nuremberg trials, the final shot we are shown before moving on to the exhibit on post-war trials is the victim of British warplanes at Nordhausen with his exposed brains. How sick to show gory imagery of Allied air attack victims as proof of the evilness of Germans. Mothers rushing their children past this section never question the context of this imagery. This is powerful, trauma-based mind control used to brainwash, not by using logic and facts, but by searing these horror images into a captive audience's mind and manipulating emotions with mendacious narrations. Real shower rooms, phony planted evidence like this lampshade, and victims of Allied bombing are not proof of a genocide using gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. We were manipulated, misled, and lied to. We were shown images taken during the final days of a destroyed and collapsed Germany as proof of a systematic planned extermination program. Upon further investigation by the Western Allies, these claims of extermination camps equipped with homicidal gas chambers in Western liberated camps have fallen by the wayside. However, the powerful imagery of these Western liberated, overcrowded, disease-infested camps devastated due to the Allied bombing campaign in the final months of the worst war in the history of mankind, is still used to brainwash the public as proof of an extermination program of gas chambers disguised as shower rooms in camps captured by the Soviet Union. In Part 2 of this documentary, we will explore some aspects of the most infamous of these camps, Auschwitz. Disclaimer: this documentary is not meant to whitewash the National Socialist regime of Germany from any of its undisputed wrongdoings. Imprisoning people without proper due process is a crime. Any authority committing such a crime ultimately bears responsibility for those in its custody. However, this crime was not only committed by the German authorities prior to and during World War II, but during the war also by the U.S. authorities, who imprisoned many Japanese Americans as well as Italian and German immigrants. The biggest criminal in this regard, however, was the U.S.'s most important ally of the Second World War, the Soviet Union, where millions were imprisoned and ultimately murdered prior to, during, and after the war. Unfortunately, this crime of unlawful incarceration is today again committed by U.S. authorities in Guantanamo Bay and other similar facilities. Holocaust Handbooks, the world's leading book series critically exploring what the powers that be don't want examined. Mesmerizing comprehensive presentations such as lectures on the Holocaust, as well as cutting-edge research results such as The Real Case for Auschwitz. Read most of our books free of charge at holocausthandbooks.com, where you can also watch our riveting documentaries. All this high-quality content was made possible by viewers like you. Please consider making a donation to help us create more of this content. We cannot do it without you. Thank you.